A new survey finds Minneapolis and St. Paul among the worst places for Black Americans to call home.
The racial inequity in this state is horrific.
When we think about wealth inequality in the United States today, that's directly attributable to problems associated with housing and denial of housing. The inability of African Americans to acquire wealth in the same way that other groups were able to, by virtue of having access to affordable housing, is one of the problems that impact those communities of color today.
About 75% of white families own the homes that they occupy. About 25% of black families own the homes that they occupy. It's actually the largest, in terms of percentage, gap in the country.
The major impediment to civil rights for African Americans' economic opportunity are these racially restrictive covenants, private contracts between individuals that allow them to dictate to whom they'll sell their property.
Covenants exist across the country. In Minneapolis, the covenants were first put in 1910. At that point, developers could start buying up large sections of farmland that adjoin the city.
When they start selling off the individual lots, that's really when the racial covenants kind of injected into the property record.
Racial covenants tells you who can or cannot live, lease, even occupy certain spaces. 100% of these covenants are aimed at African Americans.
The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining. Blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual.
In a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanctioned, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices.
Our community was redlined. Simple as that. Now, as a community, we made the best of it, and we produced a great many influential people as well. And a lot of that came from having developed a pretty powerful community. Fourth Avenue was now referred to as Crack Avenue. Up and down Fourth Avenue throughout the neighborhood, there were tough times.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
So even though covenants are now illegal, kind of this yawning chasm of wealth inequality that emerged as a result of covenants is still very much with us today. Identifying racial covenants, however, has proved remarkably challenging. The only way to find racial covenants are to read warranty deeds. We're looking at about 3 million deeds in Hennepin County between 1900 and 1960, and each deed on average runs about 3 pages. So we're in the ballpark of 10 million or so pages of text. So what we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is we're using digital tools to help us identify the deeds that do contain racially restrictive covenants. We ask volunteers to help us transcribe them. And those answers I then export, and this actually gives me enough data to build the map.
There's actually two categories. It's business industrial and undeveloped.
With this data set that the Mapping Prejudice team has built, we asked the question, how have racial covenants affected present-day socioeconomic outcomes?
And the results that we find are that covenants were a way to lift the house prices by keeping people of certain races and colors out. What we find is a causal link between covenants in the past and three present-day socioeconomic outcomes. We find that houses that were covenanted in the past have, on average, 15% higher house values today compared to houses that were not covenanted. We also find that covenanted areas have lower African American residents and lower African American home ownership rates compared to areas within Minneapolis that did not have covenants.
I think it can make very powerful arguments about how can we reframe contemporary policy through more of an equity lens to help mitigate some of this damage that's resulted from racial covenants.
And I want everyone with this map to imagine themselves in this landscape of privilege and disenfranchisement.